I'm Natalie Marine Street. I'm the program manager of the Stanford Historical Society Oral History Program. I met some of you at the conference over the last couple of days, and I'm delighted to have you all here today. In the background, I don't think you can see him, is Josh Schneider, our university archivist, and he's helping me with some of the Q&A features, etc. today. And I thank everybody that filled out the pre-workshop survey. It really helped me. We're in this webinar format, which I think is a little bit awkward because it doesn't feel like we can interact. But you do have access to the Q&A. And so I'm hoping that everybody now, could you just take a second and put into the Q&A, like, hi, who are you? Where are you coming from? What organization, or if you're a student, where you're studying, just a little bit of information so that we all know who is gathered behind this webinar screen today. All right. Okay, welcome from Belmont Historical Society. Excellent. We have Mountain View represented, a couple of people from Mountain View. Excellent. Here's our goals for today. We're going to be talking a little bit about what oral history is. We're going to talk about some principles and best practices. We're going to be throughout the day kind of assembling an oral history interview toolkit. That'll include the types of questions that are typically asked in oral history interviews, interview preparation strategies, some practical tips. I have lots of practical tips for you. We'll be discussing the very important issue of informed consent and the principle of shared authority. And we're going to get some practice evaluating some interviews from my collections that we've assembled here at the Historical Society. We'll talk a little bit about project planning and some words about family history. And if there's time, we'll talk some tips about recording and transcription. And whatever else you have on your mind. At the end, we're going to try to bring people in to conversation so that we can answer some more specific questions if I haven't covered them. And I just want everybody to remember that there is not one right way to do oral history. I'm sharing with you today some kind of best practices and principles that the community of oral historians has arrived at together throughout the years. But I don't want this to sound like a very kind of proscriptive talk. There are different ways of sharing stories in different communities. We need to honor and value those ways. And people are all the time coming up with innovative new ways to conduct oral histories and to ask questions and to record interviews. So just please keep that in mind. I don't want you to feel like if you forgot to do one thing that I mentioned today, that you're somehow a bad or an ill-prepared oral historian. That is not true. But this is just really the beginning of learning about oral history. I would love to have a whole day with you in person to do this workshop. We're going to try to squeeze it into 2 hours. So there's a lot more to learn, but one of the things I want you to know is that one of the best ways to get started in oral history is to do what you're doing here today, getting a little bit of training, and then going out and trying it out, and then keep doing it, and you'll work to kind of perfect that craft. Okay, so we're going to get going, and I want you to just listen to an example of an oral history that I have in our collections here, and just tell me what you think of this as an example of oral history.
Talking with Mark Lawrence on October 24th, 2016 as part of the Stanford Historical Society's Staff Oral History Program. Mark grew up in the Sacramento Valley town of Gridley, California, where his father was a doctor. Mark was interested in radio, and he got his first radio license when he was in the 6th grade. He applied to Stanford as an undergraduate largely because his father had graduated from Stanford Medical School. And when he arrived on the campus in the fall of 1963, his interest in radio led him to declare a major in electronic engineering. And that was at a time when the department was beginning to transform its focus from radio electronics to computers. He immediately volunteered to work for KZSU, the Stanford radio station, and thus began his association that has lasted more than 54 years. He has been KZSU's chief engineer, in which capacity he's built most of the equipment with which the station now operates. He worked full-time in the Campus Computer Center from 1972 to 2004, and there witnessed the remarkable transformation that computers have brought to Stanford. But through it all, he has remained deeply loyal to the radio station, and last week he engineered the KZSU live broadcast of the inauguration of Stanford's 11th president, Mark Tessier Levine. Bookend your life?
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to pause that for a minute. And I just want to ask if there's any reactions to that. If anybody wants to respond, if you raise your hand, I can allow you to speak from the great beyond. Anybody? Okay, I'm going to ask Leslie what she thinks about that as an example of oral history. Hi, Leslie.
Hi there.
Hey, what did you think?
So I actually liked that introduction. It wasn't super brief, but personally, if I'm going to hear someone talk, I think it's good to know their background.
Okay, very interesting. All right, thanks, Leslie. Let's see, we got Cecile has her hand up.
I agree with the earlier comment, although you said that there are no rules in oral history, but I wonder if it would have been better to let the interviewee tell you about himself. Just a question, no judgment.
Okay, interesting. All right, I know there's some other people that have their hands raised, but in the interest of time, I'm going to say that this was both a wonderful introduction and perhaps not a great example of oral history. That, as Cecile kind of indicated, that information that our interviewer gave us at the beginning of this oral history would have taken me several hours probably to elicit from our interviewee. So he kind of summarized what the very purpose of the oral history was for us. My interviewer in this case happens to be a journalist, a very good journalist. And indeed, that kind of introduction is something that we often might hear, say, on Fresh Air with Terry Gross when she was introducing, say, a famous actor or actress, and then was going to ask them to talk about their latest project, right? Or you might see that kind of an introduction when a noted person was going to give a speech and we wanted to kind of get their background out of the way. But when we're doing oral history, we really want to be mindful of this picture here and this principle. We want to let them tell the story. And this is the craft of the oral historian, is to figure out how to make everyday people who might not be naturally born storytellers into storytellers like this gentleman here who has his audience enraptured. All right. So we're going to learn some ways that you can do that today. And I want you to think about, as we go today, what are some of the differences between journalism and oral history? We heard kind of an example there, I think, in that a journalist takes a lot of information from different sources and they summarize and they synthesize and they make it into a nice package for us to understand. And oral historians might do that later down the road if they're going to, say, write a book from their transcripts. But in the craft of getting that interview out, we're trying not to apply a lot of judgment and interpretation, but rather let the interview be told, the story be told in the interviewee's own words. Okay, so what is oral history? Just to get this on the table so we know what we're talking about. Different than journalism, it is a methodology for recording and preserving oral testimony, and it often documents information that is not easily found in written records. And it often captures the voices of those who don't leave written records. And if any of you are students of history, you might have heard the term history from the bottom up. This refers to the movement in probably the late 60s, early 70s, where students of history, influenced by the context of the times perhaps, started to question, why are we only having histories about presidents or diplomats or kings and queens? What other kind of histories should we be telling and researching? And what if we had a history of workers or of women? People who perhaps were not so easily found in the historical record. So we see the birth of a lot of oral history programs in the 60s and 70s. And there's such a wonderful upwelling, if you look back at the projects that were started at that time, of interest in documenting all types of different people's voices so that they could be included in the historical record. And Stanford's program in oral history was actually started in the 1970s as well. I do want to say, though, that oral history can also be a great methodology for providing additional information about people that do leave records. It can be used to supplement the materials that are in the archive and to tell us the story that is sort of surrounding and supporting and contextualizing those documents that we might find. There might be an annual report, say, that's in the archives, but if we ask the person that was in charge of the board, you know, what was kind of behind some of those decisions and those strategies? What's the backstory? Oral history can be really wonderful methodology for that. But I want to mention this too. It's more than a methodology. It's I think a spirit or an ethos of doing research that prioritizes the interviewee. And if you think about that, that's not always the journalist's mission, right? The journalist's mission is to perhaps get to the bottom of the truth about something, or to present multiple perspectives, or even a judgment about something. But as an oral historian, at least at the level of the individual interview, you really are devoted to getting that particular subjectivity and those particular people's experiences. Okay, so hold that near. I come back to that time and time again in my work. All right, I think we could probably all think about why oral history is a good methodology and what are some of its strengths, especially in recording the really unique human voice. But I want to be on the table here about what some of the weaknesses with oral history are. And of course, the big weakness that comes to people's mind, or perhaps limitations is a better word, is that of memory. So you can see in the pictures here some of what I mean. We all know that memory fades with time, but we also have experienced the different types of memory that there are. There's something called a flashbulb memory or lightning memory, right? Which there's certain moments that even though they were very long time ago, we could talk about them in great detail now because there's an image or something that's just kind of burned into our memory. And it's very easy, even though it might have been a long time ago, for us to tell those stories. Memory is also very fluid. I have a picture of a stream here to help you remember that. Our memories change in terms of the times and the circumstances that we are recounting events. They're influenced by subsequent events and concepts that might be introduced into our vocabulary that help us to describe issues in the past in a way that we might not have understood them at the time. So I always tell people when I'm talking about oral history, when you're doing oral history, you are walking on the very tricky terrain of memory, and it's fascinating terrain. And sometimes people say to me, well, oral history is not good because people don't remember accurately. And anybody who's ever written a work of history or a history paper what you need to understand is that every source has its limitations. Every source needs to be questioned in terms of the audience it was written for, the time in which it was written, perhaps the spin that is given to a story if it's being written down in, say, an annual report, and where the silences might be in those written documents, as well as in oral histories. All right. Okay, so a very important organization to know about is the Oral History Association. And Josh is going to drop the link to this very important organization in the website. I would call it a professional association because many people that are professional oral historians or teachers of oral history belong to it and support it. But you do not have to have any kind of special credentials or education to belong to the Oral History Association. You just have to love the craft of oral history and want to learn more about it. It's a very, very welcoming group, a wonderful website with lots of resources for you. And I mentioned principles and best practices in particular, because this is a kind of a collective knowledge that has been gathered over the years that the Oral History Association offers to others about principles and best practices. And I really encourage you to become familiar with them. There's several versions that have been introduced over the years, and you can actually read back and see how the principles and best practices have changed over time. So there's a couple that I would like to introduce to you today. And you can just take a minute and read this here. This is actually from the previous version of the principles and best practices, but I love the elegance of this statement. Oral history is distinguished from other forms of interviews by its content and extent. Oral history interviews seek an in-depth account of personal experience and reflections, with sufficient time allowed for the narrators to give their story the fullness they desire. The content of oral history interviews is grounded in reflections on the past, as opposed to commentary on purely contemporary events. I'd like to emphasize that one because it can be another difference from journalism, although there are many different types of journalism. It takes time to do oral history. It's usually not something that you want to only devote a half an hour, if you can catch somebody on their lunch break. Oh, tell me your story. Our stories can take a very long time to tell. And I love this phrase, the fullness, to give their story the fullness that they desire. And so keep that in mind if you're embarking on an oral history project, that interviews we never book an interview unless we're at a kind of a special event where we're doing some special types of interviewing. I usually book an interview session for minimum of 90 minutes, maximum of 2 hours. And people always fill up that time. Another one that I want to draw your attention to that I think is very important is this one. Oral historians respect the narrators as well as the integrity of the research. Interviewers are obliged to ask historically significant questions, reflecting careful preparation for the interview and understanding of the issues to be addressed. Interviewers must also respect the narrator's equal authority in the interviews and honor their right to respond to questions in their own style and language. I emphasize this principle because it speaks to the importance of preparation. If you're interviewing, say, I know a lot of you are from local historical societies, and perhaps you want to interview people about maybe a major development project that's happened in the past, or a change in some kind of districting laws. It's really going to benefit you to go back into the historical records and understand what the issues were that were at stake, so that you can ask people about them with an informed set of knowledge. But there's a tension here, because you're not an investigative journalist necessarily. We're not usually taking that kind of approach with oral history. So we're trying to respect the narrator's point of view and their desire to tell the story in the way that they experienced it and the way that they want to record it. So you can probably imagine situations when those two things are in tension, and you have to hold that tension carefully and think about how to approach it. But oral history is not just sitting down and returning on the recorder and letting people say whatever they want to say. You guide them through the story, and sometimes it does mean asking a question that might be a little bit difficult for them to answer. Okay. I won't go through these in detail, but I'd like to just mention the point that the issue of respect for narrators and the communities from which they come is a very important one. And considering, again, those kind of diverse values that different groups might have and ways of telling stories and sharing information. And I want to emphasize the issue of preservation. We're not going to talk nitty-gritty about preservation here too much today, but the point of oral history is not just for people to tell their stories, but for us to preserve them in a way that they'll be accessible to generations many, many decades from now. So as you're embarking on a project, you really need to think carefully about this issue of preservation. And something being just in your on your hard drive of your computer is not an adequate preservation policy. We can talk some more about that as we get into the Q&A, but you want to be thinking about how you're keeping these interviews safe from the very beginning of the projects that you're going to embark upon. All right, I want to say a word about planning, but I just want to check really quickly to see if there's any burning questions that anybody has. You can raise your hand or put it in the Q&A. Anything about what I've said so far that anybody wants to weigh in on? Okay, I think we're good. So I want to talk a brief minute about planning. And I get this question a lot, why do I have to plan? I just want to go talk to people. So why do we plan? Really, planning needs to take place at any level of a project. So what I mean by that is if you're planning to interview a lot of people, you want to do project level planning. But if you're only going to be interviewing one person, you still need to do some planning. Why do we plan? Again, that best practice of asking historically significant questions. We're not going to know how to we're not going to know what to ask if we haven't done a little bit of thought and planning. But you're also planning really for the sake of your interviewee. And I emphasize that because these people are taking their time and they're telling you their stories and their perspectives. And that is a real gift that they're giving to you as an oral historian. And you need to put in the time and the work to be well prepared to hear and preserve that story. So just think about that. I have a picture here of an interview that we did for the Disability at Stanford project. And it was the first interview that we had ever done with someone that was deaf. And we had a sign language interpreter. We actually had several interpreters because it was a long interview. We also had to take care for some of our parties were visually impaired. So we were thinking about that. There was a lot of planning that went into that interview. All right. Some of my students sometimes say, I don't want it to be all planned sounding. I just like to be spontaneous and go with the flow. And what I want to say to you here is that the planning will allow you to be spontaneous. It is not a mutually exclusive situation that we're in here. If you're well grounded in the background of your subject and the historical time, you'll really be able to ask questions and take things in interesting directions. And the interview will be all the richer for it. Okay. So just some examples. Some people say, what do you mean by interview project. So we've done a lot of different projects here at Stanford, and you can, read the names of some of them. But it's just, instead of just having an oral history, say a life history about a person's life, you could also have a theme project where you're investigating a specific theme or a specific topic or a specific event. And the movement project is an example I'll be referring to throughout the presentation today. It was a group of anti-Vietnam War activists that were active at Stanford, and they came to us a few years ago, and they were having an anniversary of an organization that they had formed and wanted to do some oral histories. And so we worked together to develop a protocol that would allow them to talk both about the events that happened at Stanford, but also kind of the knowledge and experience with activism that they may or may not have brought with them to Stanford. And then what were the ripple effects of the events that they were involved in during that time here on campus? How did it, if it did, how did it impact their lives? It was a really interesting project. Okay, so when you're planning, you want to start with the big picture. This is really important to take a step back and think about, why is this important and what do we hope at the end of the project we'll be able to have gained? Is oral history the right methodology for doing this kind of project? And what are our kind of guiding questions that we want to include? Just some questions that you hope you'll have some insights to at the end of the project. This is difficult intellectual work, but you really should be doing it if you're embarking on an oral history project. You should also think about what has already been done. There's a lot of wonderful oral history archives and projects out there. Is there anything that has been done that is similar to what you want to do? How could you build on it? How could the way they approached the project give you some good ideas, or perhaps drive you in different directions? So you're starting with that big picture. Another part of the big picture is thinking about your interviewees. So not the specific names maybe at this point, but just the kinds of people in general that you want to interview. What varying perspectives do you need to have in order for this to be a good interview project? So here I have an example. You probably can't see much of the detail, but this is the org chart at Stanford for the provost's office. There's all kinds of different offices that report up under the provost. If you're trying to document the history of Stanford University using the methodology of oral history, this org chart becomes very important, because you want to think about getting perspectives from each of these different organizations. But so perhaps you could go talk to the head of each of those little squares that are there, and they could give you a picture of the university. But that might be a very top-down kind of perspective, right? So what are some other voices and perspectives that we might want to add to our Stanford Oral History project? Perhaps we need some students in there, some workers who were not leaders, faculty from all different kinds of disciplines, perhaps people that are not faculty, but that are on a teaching line, for example. So you want to think about those differing perspectives and angles as you're planning. You also need to think about getting some help. Do you want to form an advisory group to help you with the project? Maybe members of the advisory group don't actually do the interviews, but perhaps they know a lot about the subject and can help you to make sure you talk to certain people or explore certain questions. Here's a picture of my advisory group, the Oral History Committee. They've been a great source of what subjects should we explore and who should we talk to as we're trying to document the history of Stanford University. You should also talk to members of the community. If you're going to be doing an interview project about a specific community, is this just you going in there with your research agenda, or is there a way that you can involve the members of the community? So this project would ultimately help to serve not just your research idea, but the needs that the community might have. and they can be of tremendous help in opening doors to you and suggesting topics and people to interview. Also, looking into the historical sources that might exist is a really good idea at this time, because again, it's going to give you a sense of the history that you're trying to enrich with these interviews. All right, another thing you need to think about is end use and audience. So how are you hoping that your interviews will ultimately be used? It's going to impact the way that you go about your interviewing. I don't know if anyone saw the wonderful documentary Attica that was released about a year ago. It's an incredible use of oral history in that documentary film. I just was so impressed by the way those filmmakers interwove those interviews throughout that film. But if you're going to be, if you think you want to be doing a documentary, you really are going to have to think about some things in terms of the way you film those interviews. Podcasts are often constructed out of excerpts of oral histories. But again, if you know you want to do that, you're going to want to think about that up front, because it's going to impact the way you record. You might want to put clips on a website, or perhaps use excerpts from the interviews in a book. But it's good to sort of think about these things up front. And also, who is your intended audience? If you're hoping to do a project so that school children will learn more about their community, you probably need to make sure to ask some questions of your interviewees that won't assume a lot of deep historical knowledge. You could ask those questions as well, but you want to have some content in there that might be at the level of understanding and explain things in a way that school children would understand. Okay, so the next thing you do after having that big picture is you got to put together sort of your topics and questions. What are we going to talk about? I always start with a list of general topics that we want to explore. In our faculty project here at Stanford, these are some of the topics, big kind of chunks of content that we want to get to. One of them is about coming to Stanford. How did you get here? What networks or opportunities led you here? We also always do a big section on research and publications so that we can devote a lot of attention to that. But we also want to talk about teaching and students. So once you have those kind of, and just a word here, you want to make sure that those topics are going to be tying back to those guiding questions, right? Then you'll develop some specific questions for each topic. And you might want to think about questions that you'd like to tell your interviewers to be sure to ask this question to everyone. And the reason for that, one, it can just be interesting to see what different people say. But if you're thinking about end usage, that can be a really wonderful way to include multiple voices answering the same exact question. We did a project on John W. Gardner recently, who was a Stanford alum and was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under Lyndon Baines Johnson. And one of the questions that we asked all of the interviewees was, if you could have 3 words to use to describe John W. Gardner, what would they be? We gave our interviewees a heads up that we were going to ask them that question, and they gave some great thought to it. And now we have wonderful recordings where we could put those words together in a montage. It would be a really, really neat clip to have on the project site. Okay, then you're going to be thinking about your interviewees a little bit more deeply. You have those general categories that you developed, but which specific people should you talk to? Again, you'll be asking your collaborators for advice about who should be interviewed. You could ask historians or librarians. They might say, wow, I know this person was really involved in that movement at the time. You should be sure to talk to them. And then you're going to ask these kind of first round of interviewees, you're going to ask them for some suggestions for who else should we talk to about that project. We're going to call this a snowball sampling, because you start with this small group And then that group helps you to find the rest of the people for your project. You can also look back in historical sources. This is what we did for the Disability at Stanford project. We looked back in the Stanford Daily and found out who was the staff, who were the students' names that were mentioned, and we contacted those students. You can also post notices. If there's a community newspaper and you're looking to do a project, you could post a notice and see what comes of that. Okay, I have a question that I want to answer from Chris in the chat. She says, is it typical or good practice to provide your interviewees with the outline or even specific questions in advance? This is a great question. Typically, we do provide an outline of the topics that we are going to be asking, so they have some idea of what the interview is going to be about. And people differ on whether you should provide them the specific questions. I usually try not to provide the actual questions because I don't want people to be, I want them to be in the interview and not in the question list. But if there's a particularly thoughtful question, like the one that I mentioned with Gardner, or if there's a controversial question, often it can be a good idea to provide people with that information up front. All right, thanks for the question. I want to just say a little bit about some practicalities and thinking about when you're planning. You need to think about the resources that you have available. How many interviews do you want to do? Who's going to do the interviews and how can you get them some basic training? What consent agreements do you need to have in place? And are there any special considerations that you need to be thinking about for the particular project that you want to embark on? How are you going to record? Do you want to use video or audio only? What type of equipment are you going to use? What format of file format are you going to use? And do you have the resources to get the interviews transcribed? And can you figure out a way that your interviewees can review somehow the transcript or the recording to make sure that they're comfortable with it? And then again, what strategies for preservation and sharing with the community are you going to have in your project? It's always a good idea if you're doing a project to find a repository for it before you start the project. That way, if there's particular forms or things that they would like to know to be able to house the collection, you know that right up front and you're not having to go back to interviewees for additional forms or information. Also, if you're doing a large project, it can very quickly get out of control in terms of where are different interviews in the process. Did they say that they would be interviewed? Do I have an interviewer assigned? Did I get the recording back? Did we get it transcribed? There's really a lot to keep track of. So thinking of a system to keep track of the stages of the process is really important. All right, and then you're going to write up this plan, and I'll share in the resources that I'll send you after this, which will include the slides. I saw somebody ask about that. I'll send you a link to our kind of project template. You don't have to do it exactly this way, but it gives you some ideas of some things that you could record in your project plan. And here's an example. I won't go through this, but you'll have it in the slides of that movement project that I referred to. This was the project plan that the steering committee came up with. And, you know, it took them a long time to decide what they wanted to call the project because there were some differences in the group. And just in trying to figure out what to name the project, they were able to kind of suss out those differences and come to an agreement about what the goal of the project was. I mentioned the special considerations, and there's an example here under the participant guidelines section. They were a little bit worried because some of the activities that happened at Stanford in the late 60s did involve some kind of property damage and nothing I don't think too major, but there was a concern that some people didn't want their student activities to be recorded for the public record. statute of limitations on those has long expired, but they came to an agreement in the group to be careful about saying, oh, and then so-and-so threw that bottle into the window. They tried not to mention names unless they had, it was a known matter of public record already, or they'd cleared it with the person. So they tried to anonymize those instead of giving specific names. And it was great that the group came up with that, that special guideline. All right. I hope everybody's doing all right. We're going to get into some listening exercises in a minute, but before we do that, anything that I've said so far about project planning that anybody has a question about, you can either put it in the Q&A or raise your hand. Anybody? Okay. All right. I hope we're doing well here. Oh, wait, I think we do have a question. What about determining the budget? Great question. Oral history can be done very inexpensively. You can record an oral history if you want to on your iPhone, but you need to think through the considerations. Are you going to have it transcribed? Do you want to have video content? How pristine do you need your audio content to be? I would say that when we're budgeting for transcription, well, I can share some specifics, but determining the budget is probably the biggest expense that you need to think about is your interviewer's time. If you have volunteers that are doing these interviews, then you don't have an expense there. But if you are want somebody that's a professional oral historian to do the interviews, you're going to need to compensate them for their time in both preparing for the interviews and then doing them, and then any kind of review process you would like them to do with the interview. So those are all things to think about. Transcription is another thing that you might want to budget for. People always ask me about automated transcription. Can't we just put it in the automated engine and it will do it for us? And I will say, yes, you can do that and it's cheaper, but you will still need a human to check that because the humans are still beating the robots in terms of accuracy for transcription. Okay, if you need to pause the interview for some reason, how would you get into it again? Great question. I think I can show you an example of that in the things that we'll get to. And I'm also going to show you a tool that will help you to get back into the interview again. All right. Okay, I'm going to ask Josh to drop into the chat a link to some excerpts that we're going to be listening to. This is just to make these excerpts a little bit more accessible if you're having trouble hearing or understanding the audio for any reason. And what we're going to do is we're going to listen to 3 excerpts in a row. And I want you to just really put on your listening ears and listen to these. And we're thinking about the beginning of an interview. What makes for a good beginning of an interview? What do you like that you're hearing in these interviews? What do you maybe wish might have been done differently? And is there anything that you're hearing that you might want to follow up on later in the interview? These are all interviews taken from the Stanford collections, and I think most of them are done by volunteer interviewers.
Hi, this is Allison Tracy. It is June 5th, 2013. I'm here with Professor Ron Redholes to conduct our first interview for the Faculty Oral History Project, which is being done by the Stanford Historical Society. To start out, Ron, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up.
In St. Louis, Missouri, and grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. I was born there in 1932. My father always claimed that my mother did not graduate from grade school. She had insisted that she did graduate from grade school. My father graduated from high school and continued to study at night for banking information. He was a teller at the First National Bank in St. Louis, and he wanted to improve his job and his pay, which is always abysmal. And so he actually went blind reading these books and under the inadequate lighting in the kitchen, which is where he read. And by the time he died in 1970, he could scarcely see anything at all. So I grew up with a strong anti-bank attitude. I detested the bank and banking and the industry that it served.
Today is Saturday, March 10th of 2012. I'm a volunteer interviewer with the Stanford Historical Society, and Professor Carl Degler is being gracious enough to spend some time sharing his recollections of his life as a historian and his experiences at Stanford with the Historical Society. And I'm starting this interview recording it at about 3:40 p.m. and I am going to try and do it right. Professor Degler, would you like to say hello to posterity?
Well, sure. Posterity, I'm going to be waiting for him.
Professor Degler, could you start off by telling us a little bit about what you think were the high points of your life as a historian? The really important things to you.
Let's start, if you don't mind, kind of at the beginning, which is always a good place to start. Let's start with just you talking a little bit about your early life, your early education, how you became interested in science and in chemistry in particular.
My recollection of my interest in science is that I was always kind of interested in it. I was encouraged by my father, who thought science or technology was interesting, but it just seemed very natural to me. And so, as far back as I can remember, it seemed plausible to me that I would go into science or some kind of technology. I didn't really know very much about it, frankly, like all kids. And I didn't know anybody really that did science.
All right. So let's just take a minute, and you can either raise your hand or put in the chat. What did you think? Any reactions to any three of those clips? Again, we're thinking about the good beginnings to an interview. Any reactions or thoughts? See some hands. All right, let's hear from Pamela. Hi, Pamela.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this. I always like to hear at the very beginning, where was a person born and raised? Because I think it kind of depends on, it informs you where the person grew up, maybe that, it just adds more. The second interview just launched right in about how he got started, and it really didn't have a preamble as far as this is where I was born and where I was raised, because you don't know the photograph. You don't know how old that individual is when that interview was conducted. So I think that's important for people to know, how old is this person
Great.
when the interview was conducted.
Great. All right, let's hear from Lori.
Hello, thank you. A couple things I noticed. The first one, her intro was not quite as clear as the others, but her question really elicited a very emotional, meaningful response. And so I thought the question was, the most effective on the first one. The second one, I loved how there was a little bit of humor there, and she acknowledged him for being gracious and her voice was clear, but jumping right into the high points of life as a historian was such an abstract question that I don't know if that silence was there because you ended the clip, or if there was an actual silence of the interviewee having to think. And same thing with the third. It was broad and there were multiple questions actually all in one. So anyway, those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to either put it in the Q&A or raise your hand? Okay, these are excellent, excellent points. And again, we're thinking about good beginnings of the interview. So you heard in the first clip with Ron Rebholz, a really nice intro. She laid it down for us. Who are these people? Allison Tracy and Ron Rebholz. What date and year are we in? And then she asks a kind of nice open-ended question, right? Tell me a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up, something like that. And as Lori said, we get a really, really interesting beginning to this oral history. We're all of a sudden at the table with the father pouring over the books, an anti-bank attitude in the family, a controversy about whether his mother actually went to school beyond a certain grade, etc. So a lot right there. And isn't it interesting to see how someone begins to narrate their life? It's a really fascinating question that one could write a book about and do a study about. But thinking about how he decided to start that narrative was really interesting. Now, I've had people say, oh my goodness, this is terrible. That interview, he's just all over the place. He's talking about St. Louis and banks and what are we going to do now? And I think it's a wonderful beginning to the interview. There are some things that the interviewer will need to go back and follow up on, but we really have a nice beginning. And we're getting him warmed up, right? He's telling us this story about his early life. All right, and then I like this point too about the second clip. Very different place that she started, right? Not at the beginning and when were you born and where did you grow up, but very high level question, right? I might ask that question of an interviewee at the very end of a session, but not at the beginning whenever we're trying to get the narrative flowing and getting in there. Let's see, and the third clip I put in there because it's a very common thing that happens with interviewers. You have all of these things that you want to know. And sometimes we tend to throw out a lot of questions at once. And it's best if you can to try to ask one question at a time. Because what will happen is your interviewee, as we saw just in this case here, will answer the last question that they heard. And then you as the interviewer are going to have to backtrack. Okay, he told me about that thing, but now I have to backtrack and get the answers to those other questions. So it's hard to discipline yourself to do that. But if you can ask one question at a time, that's really preferred. And then, just another thing to emphasize in our second clip, we learned who the interviewee was, but not the interviewer. You, the interviewer, are a really important part of the oral history. It is essential that we know that you recognize that. We have a notion in oral history that we call intersubjectivity. And it's this idea that the product that is produced, the conversation that happens, is really depends on the identities of both of those individuals. So having some sense of who you are is really important, and you're bringing a lot to the table. So don't be afraid to say your name for the historical record. as well. All right, I want to just review what I just showed you with those clips, and that's some things for you to put in your oral history interview toolkit. The first thing that we heard was a brief introduction. Who, what, where, when, and why. This is really important for our archivist friends in the audience. You might have, as we do at Stanford, some recordings in our collection that ended up in the collection for one reason or another, but we didn't get that nice lead on the beginning. So we don't actually know who the people are that are talking on the recording, or indeed when the recording took place. We might be able to make some guesses based upon the media that it was recorded on. But that's a really important thing to consider. And don't say, well, I'll just put it in the file name on my computer, or I'll write it on the envelope. Those things can get separated. So you really want to have who, what, where, and when right at the beginning. A tip that I give is to ask people to reintroduce themselves. You can give that introduction, but then ask them to kind of say their name and do that introduction of themselves, because then we have a wonderful bit of audio of them saying their name in their preferred pronunciation, which you may or may not have gotten exactly the way they would say it. And it's also lovely to think about how you might reuse that down the road in an interview clip or a documentary. And we started to hear some different kind of question tools. We heard in the interview with Ron Rebholz an example of an open question, a question that really is giving your interviewee a lot of control over the response. Tell me something about the place where you grew up. You can't answer that with a yes or a no question. This is, again, how we make our interviewees into storytellers, is we ask them these kind of questions, which are encouraging them to open up and tell us something more complicated than yes or no. Here's one that I like for family history projects. You know, what was your wedding like? You're asking them again to tell you the story. Now the open question is probably the most important tool in your toolkit, but you're also going to need to use closed questions from time to time. These are giving you, the interviewer, greater control over things. And you use them to focus on a specific topic or detail of a topic. So some examples here. What were your parents' names? If you're doing family oral history, trying to get these really basic things that people in the future are going to be interested in knowing is really important. Or one that I use in some of our Stanford staff oral history interviews is trying to ascertain, reporting structure. So who did you report to when you had that job? That would be an example of a question where we're looking for a specific detail. So you'll need to have those in your toolkit too. All right, and thinking also about good beginnings to interviews, we're going to talk a little bit about interview preparation tools. Here's the 4 that I want to address briefly. The first one is the project plan. We already talked about that. But then the second is the preliminary meeting. And this is not a recorded meeting. It's just a preliminary kind of get to know you. And I get a lot of pushback on this point. Why is this important? Why do I need to take the time to do a preliminary meeting? I think it's important, one, because you're establishing informed consent. You're taking the time to make sure that the interviewer really understands what doing an oral history is, and you're going to be discussing perhaps the preservation and usage options for the interview. But you're also doing this to just establish a rapport with your interviewer, your interviewee. That kind of trust building and relationship building, it can really enrich the interview. you don't want to be doing it during the interview so much in terms of relating information about yourself. You want the focus to be on the interviewee during the interview. So that preliminary meeting is an opportunity for you to share some of yourself with your subject. You're also doing this preliminary meeting to kind of check out the scene. If you're doing remote recording, you can identify any kind of technical issues. Maybe there's not a strong internet connection, or there's some problems with computer equipment, etc. Or perhaps you might realize that your interviewee is really pretty frail and talking for a 90-minute session would be difficult for them. So get to figure that all out in that preliminary meeting. Another thing that's really important conceptually is by taking the time to do that, it's giving your interviewee a chance to help to shape the interview, right? This is not just you, the journalist, going in there to suck their story out of them for your particular story needs. This is where they get a chance to say, you know, what I really want to talk about is this. And in oral history world, we call this notion shared authority. So it's bringing your subject into the very process of creating the interview. And an example I like to give was I was doing an interview with Gavin Wright, who's one of our very noted economic historians here at Stanford. And we were having the preliminary meeting, and I had come, prepared to to ask him to talk about his graduate student advisor and his graduate education. And he said, I'll do that. I'll be prepared for that. But what I really want you to understand is what was important to me when I was in graduate school was the political organizing work that I was doing. Well, I had no idea that this was such a big part of his story. And it was wonderful for me to know that. I was able to then do some additional historical research, and he wanted that to be a part of his story. And we got just a wonderful, rich interview about that time in his life and the things that were, morally and ethically important to him. Another reason you're doing this is to activate the memory. Sometimes you hit somebody with a question in an interview and they haven't thought about it for a long time and there's just nothing there. But if you sort of let them know that this is a subject that I'm interested in talking about, could you give it some thought? So things sort of start to bubble up to the surface. So a couple of tips about the preliminary meeting, though. People always say, well, how prepared do I need to be? You do need to do some basic preparation. Usually I come with some basic info about the project. You should know that already. And then a list of kind of general topics. For example, with faculty members, they often are involved in a lot of professional service with journals, etc. So I'll say, I'd like to talk about the subtopic of professional service. Which of the different groups that you're involved with are especially important to you, and we can kind of map that out together. But really important tip here is you can't let them tell you the whole story yet. So you need to frame this meeting as, I don't want to do the interview now. Don't tell me that story yet. We're just kind of talking about what we're going to talk about. So if your preliminary meeting is going for more than, say, 45 minutes, you might have gotten into the actual storytelling phase. And you want to be careful of that, because what happens is then when you do the interview, people say, oh yeah, but you know that already. I told you that. And they did, but you weren't recording it. Okay, so that's preliminary meeting, really important. I do urge you to do it. Informed consent, we talked about, really making sure they understand the purpose of the interview and how it's going to be used. If you're going to deposit it in an archive of some sort, you'll need an interview donation form of some type where they're agreeing to this. You might also discuss with them what options will be available for them to review the interview materials or the transcript. At Stanford, we do transcribe everything, and then we do sort of a light edit of the transcript to make sure it's accurate and eliminate a lot of false starts if they're getting away in the way of the readability of the interview. But then we let our interviewee take a look at it, and they might say, oh, I really shouldn't have told that story. Is it possible for us to take that out, etc. So that's part of that shared authority, is making sure that they feel comfortable with what is going into the archive. And there are, depending upon how you're archiving things, there might be different options for how you treat sensitive information. For example, we have a project that we did at Stanford about the experience of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And because we interviewed a lot of students and some staff members who are still actively working at Stanford, we're not going to make those interviews immediately available. There'll be an embargo period of some number of years before those become available. Okay, another tool is background research, right? We talked about the importance of asking historically important questions, things that are historically significant. Well, to do that, you need to know a little bit, you need to do some research. Learn what you can about your interviewee. If they're not somebody whose name might have appeared in the papers, or you can't find anything about them as an individual, what about the historical context in which they're located? You know, let's say you're interviewing somebody that was a miner. Maybe you could do some research into that type of mining, so you might be aware of some type of questions that you could ask them about specific processes, or perhaps technological changes that happened during the time that they were in the mines, or about the particular mine that they were working in. What I do when I prepare for an interview, the first thing I do is I start to make a timeline where I understand the main events in my interviewee's life. But then I'm also doing a timeline of the kind of contexts, that the other historical contexts that might be important in their life. For example, the Vietnam War at Stanford. We have some pictures here of some of the protest and student activism that were happening in the late 60s, early 70s at Stanford. And it's important because if I'm interviewing, say, a staff or a faculty member that was here during that time, and I've got that timeline mapped out, I could say, oh, hey, you started teaching in 1970, and that was the year when, you know, we had the big protests and we canceled classes for some time, etc. And I could ask about that experience. And your interviewees' lives are going, those contexts are going to be different depending upon, you know, what their occupation was, what country they were from, what part of the country they live in, etc. But that timeline will really help to guide you as you prepare. I'll say about background research is you're never going to know it all. So don't beat yourself up too much about feeling like you have to become an expert before you do the interview. But doing some background research will really enrich the interview. All right, the last thing I want to talk about here in this part of our toolkit is how do you make an interview flow? Jamil had asked, well, if I stop the interview, how do I get it back started again? And this interview outline is really going to help you. So this is based on those topics that you developed for your project, as well as the preliminary meeting that you had. And you just kind of map out what do we want to cover here, and how might I organize this interview so that I can guide the interviewee through these topics. There's no right or wrong way to do an outline. You should do what makes sense to you. What I do is, here's an example of pretty much how mine look here. If there's key dates that I want to have at my fingertips, I put them in my, my outline. But it just gives me a sense of what I want to cover and what I've agreed that we're going to cover with the interviewee. And what's great about this is if you do have a pause, you can sort of take a look at your outline very quickly and figure out what you want to come back to, where you left off, and where you want to restart. People ask me this question all the time related to the outline and the question list. And a lot of people are very nervous if you haven't done a lot of interviews, and you're really worried that if you don't have your question list with you, that you're going to mess it up. And the example that I'd like to talk about is one of my volunteer interviewers is a wonderful interviewer. He does the best background research and preparation of anybody that I've ever worked with. But I really had to work with him to get him to let go of his question list, because what was happening is he had done such a good job preparing these questions that he wasn't listening. So his interviewee would kind of give an answer that already had addressed that question. And then he would see that it was next on his question list and he would ask it. And the interviewee would say, well, didn't I just answer that? And he did, but my interviewer wasn't listening because he was worried about this big giant question list. So what I tell people is bring your question list, stick it under the chair. If you need it, you can grab it, but try to go with the outline that'll give you a general guide, and then listen, be in that conversation and let it go where it takes you. But you have the list of topics if you need to bring the conversation back, and make sure you address those topics. Okay. All right, I say have this outline, but be prepared to abandon it. Sometimes interviews take you in unexpected directions, and it's okay if things get a little bit out of sequence, but you do want to try to address these major topical areas that you've agreed on. And I can show you some tricks for how to do that. And you're aiming for kind of a conversational tone and flow. I get this question a lot, how formal should this be? And you want things to be organized, but it doesn't need to sound like a very formal kind of talk show type interview that would be broadcast on the news. You're going for conversational tone. Okay. If any of you are interested in family history, I'm not going to go into this. Here's some beautiful pictures of families, and I will give you. I'll share with you my topics and sample questions for family history. And just to show you quickly what some of the kind of topic groupings that you can cover in family history that really will help to enrich the interview if you think about some of these topics. So I won't go into that now in the interest of time. And I think we should take just a little break to give everybody a little bit of a rest, and also to think of any questions that you have. And when we come back, we're going to listen to some more examples. Okay. All right, everyone. We are ready to go again. We're going to listen to some more excerpts, and we're going to do what we did last time. I'm going to play a few of them in a row. And we are in the heart of the interview right now. So again, I want you to get out your oral historian's ears and really listen to what you're hearing, watch what the interviewer is doing, and again, see what intrigues you, what you like, what you might have done differently. This first clip is with Linda Dairiki-Shortliff, one of our emerita professors here at Stanford. And I think you'll understand the historical context of which she's speaking as the interview clip goes along. She's a little hard to hear, so make your volume up as much as you can.
So what happened when he got up to Nebraska?
So he taught there, and that's where he met my mom. And my mom had been released for a different reason. She was younger by about 3 years, and she and her family had converted to Seventh-day Adventist religion. They were also farming pickers, berry pickers, but they converted after one of their children died, and they were convinced that this was a problem with the Buddhist religion, so they got converted to Seventh-day Adventist religion and ended up going to Santa Anita, to Tan Fran, right in the Bay Area, the Tan Fran racetrack, which was in the Bay Area, and then down to so-called, as they called it, Bing Crosby's racetrack, which is Santa Anita racetrack, and then got sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. So her whole family ended up in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. But they were sponsored. You could be sponsored by Midwest families, church families. So their family got sponsored by I guess the Seventh-day Adventist Church to go to Lincoln, Nebraska. So this was a great meeting place for them. And they ended up meeting in Lincoln.
No kidding. So where did you say they originated then? Were they the Bay Area?
Yes,
they were Bay Area, and then they ended up in Wyoming.
Because this was all fruit and berry. The whole El Camino was just lined, and Milpitas was, I guess they were from Milpitas. That whole was just berries and fruit trees.
Right. Interesting. Now, you said that they converted because there was a problem that they felt there was a problem with the Buddhist religion. Could you clarify what you meant about that?
I think what happened was that they had a brother, the oldest boy, which was, I think he was the one between my two aunts. So he was the older son the oldest son in their family. Probably had appendicitis. We don't really know what he had, but he wasn't allowed to go to the hospital or wasn't admitted. A doctor came out to the house, but by then he ended up dying. And so they decided that I guess that was, they were vulnerable at the time, that the Buddhist religion did not help them or save their child. So it was a time that somebody came around and they were easily converted at that time.
Interesting. Would they have been allowed to go to the local hospital because of their ethnicity? Do you know?
You know, I don't know. My mother wasn't clear about that either because she was only a couple of years old. So she doesn't really know. She knows that for some reason he wasn't able to go into the hospital. So she thinks that it was unclear why.
Yeah, it's a sad story.
Yeah, so he ended up dying of as she said, a stomach ache is what
That's how she remembers it.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so then they meet in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then where does their journey take them from there?
So from there, my dad, in communication with his parents actually, after the war, and they were released from Lincoln, he wanted to continue his education. So he got a master's and he was accepted at Harvard for a master's.
And it's interesting to be the only woman, and because I've done that with California Water Service Company.
Oh, that's right.
I was the first woman and the only woman for probably 10 years. And I'm going to be going off that board in May. But I always feel that a woman has an advantage, but she needs to take advantage of that advantage. And I think being feminine is something that gives you a huge advantage. And a lot of times women don't do that because they come in with sort of their, muscles flexed and thinking they're going to battle. And you don't need to battle. You prove yourself by your capability or your whatever you may be able to offer, but you don't need to become a man to do it.
What would be an example of bringing the feminine to a boardroom?
Just the way you deal with people, or had one situation, I can't really describe it, but because it's a confidential thing, but where we had a change in management. And they asked if I would meet with an individual who was having some problems and so forth. And I did. As a matter of fact, I did that in another situation where there had been some accusation that was incorrect against somebody, but I was the one that they asked. I think you're not threatening, and sometimes they may think you listen more.
So it's not by dint of you being on the Human Resource Committee or something?
No,
it's just
no, it's just, I
Linda
think,
has the skills to
well, I
have
think
this
it's sort of
conversation.
style, again, if you're not real aggressive, and I think that's part of it.
So I want to ask you a little bit about this sample that you're working with. And
Yes.
you mentioned the big computer tape that they sent up. Can you tell me a little bit about how you were working with this data? And I'm trying to get a sense of the work process at that time. What did it involve?
Yes. Well, let me start by talking about the summer of 1966. Doing quantitative research at that time involved working with big decks of IBM cards and going to the computer center. So not only did we not have laptops, we didn't have desktops in our office. We had to go off to the computer center. It became a kind of home away from home. People, it was open all night long, and I think some people may have slept there or at least spent the night there. I never went quite that far. But really, any work time that I had where I was either not doing some teaching related thing or not at home, I would be at that computer center. And very typically, I would work out. You have to figure out how to program your job. And then you might leave the whole box of cards in there, because every one of these farms corresponded to one card in that deck, and then there'd be some cards at the front that would tell the computer what you wanted done. So you'd leave it at night and come back the next morning.
And the cards would just get fed through?
Yeah, they get fed through a kind of card reader. And that's the way you would enter your information and your programming request. And you'd come and get your printout at a certain printout location, say the following morning. Now, very likely you would have invested all this time, you left it overnight, you come back full of hope the next morning, programming error. You had to get every little line right. This was not a smart computer. This was a very constraining computer. Some people date.
All right, and for our last example, we don't have any audio, but I wonder if I might ask for a volunteer from the audience that we could do a dramatic reenactment. Could we have 2 volunteers, somebody to be Knowles and somebody to be interviewer? We have any hands? All right, we've got some volunteers. Okay, we're going to have Pam Moreland. I would like you to be George Knowles, and can we get Chris to be the interviewer? Okay, and take it away, Pam.
I'll start with Knowles, and then partly, I suppose, my experience in the war led me to being asked by a colleague in the department to join a group of 5 professors to go to the University of Tokyo, where arrangements were made for developing a series of seminars. You knew about this, did you?
Yes.
Well, I don't need to go into it then.
Okay. All right. So we had 4 examples, and let's just start with that one. I throw that in there for a little bit of humor. But what might our interviewer have done differently to get Knowles to tell this story? Pam, you got any ideas?
Sure, I would have said, no, tell me about it. Even if I knew about it, I would have said, no, tell me about it.
All right, so you would have acted like really curious, want to get that sense of curiosity. Okay, any other thoughts? Anybody? Pam? You?
Well, sometimes you got to play dumb in interviews.
Yeah, okay. So Pam's going to play dumb. Okay, let's see. We got some other hands up. We got Cecile. Do you have any ideas on this one?
I think I would have, I might have asked what was his experience in the war that led to being asked by the department. And what was the motivation of going to the University of Tokyo?
Okay, so you'd ask some questions kind of around this. All right, good. I think those are both great answers. I'm going to take one more because I see Al has her hand up.
I would say, yes, I do know a little bit about this, but I'd love to hear about it in your words so that the people who listen to this in the future can hear it directly from you.
Okay, so you and Tam are taking different approaches. Both of those are pretty good approaches. I think I probably might use this latter approach just in the, I want him to think that I prepared for the interview and I should have known about this. But this is a really common scenario. And we did throw it in here for a little bit of levity, but it's very much true that people are surprised that you know as much about them as you do. And there comes a point where they think a little bit like, why am I telling you this? Because you already know all of this information about this subject. And of course, you know about the subject because you're a well-prepared interviewer, but the point is to get it on the record. And this problem we call kind of insider knowledge, right? And it can be a real challenge, especially if, let's say, I know we have people from local historical societies here. You probably know the history pretty well. And the interviewee knows the history pretty well. But the people that are listening to this 50 years from now might have no idea about the names of the people that you're talking to, or the events, or understanding any of the things that you are kind of assuming this knowledge between you. So it's something to be aware of, to make sure that the information that you're sort of assuming everybody understands really gets articulated for the audience. Okay, let's just move back to some of those other interviews that we listened to. We had Gavin Wright talking about a computer tape. We had Linda Dyriki Shortlift talking about her parents' experience in the internment camps during World War II. And we had a female member of the Board of Trustees giving her ideas about femininity in the boardroom. And I just want to ask for anybody's impressions of any of these interviews. Pam, you have your hand up.
So on the family history by the urologist, yeah. I really connected with her on several levels, but the one level is that family history, you don't ask questions. And people don't really remember what actually happened or why. Her mother was young and all knew that her brother died of a stomach ache. And my cousin is the family genealogist, and she's come up with stories like that. And it's fascinating how families kind of close ranks and don't tell you the whole story. I think that's wonderful. And I don't know how to go about finding out more information about what really happened. But I thought that was just a good example of that.
Yeah, it is. And sometimes, even if you ask, you won't find out what really happened. We actually saw a little bit of an example here. The family story was a little bit fragmented, right? So there was a story that had been passed down, but we don't really know all of the details. And you find that really frequently with oral history, but it's okay. Sometimes that fragmentation and those silences that exist within our stories are very telling in and of themselves. All right, so I just want to go to the chat for a minute because Nicole and Mani had some great ideas for how to handle the Knowles situation that I didn't put up before. The interviewer should ask them to tell it for the historical record. So yeah, you could admit your knowledge of the event, but please tell it for the recording and to share your recollection anyway. So those are great answers too. All right, any other thoughts on what you saw or heard in those clips? And think about what the interviewer was doing. All right, let's see, Lori. Let's hear from Lori.
Hi, yes. In the very first one, I liked the way the interviewer helped guide the story. She would go back sometimes after a long bit, a response, and say and clarify, oh, they were in the Bay Area. But then once the clarification happened, she then took her interviewee back to the point in the story. So, okay, they were in the Bay Area and then they ended up in Wyoming. And so she sort of kind of clarified and helped guide, and she asked follow-up questions, but then she kind of would bring it back again, like, okay, so that's how she remembers it. So they meet in Lincoln, Nebraska. So she kind of, I thought, did a good job of going back to ask clarification, but not getting lost.
Great. Thanks. Does anybody else have anything else to say about that particular clip? And then I'll respond to Lori's comments. Let's see. I see Mani has her hand up, or his hand up. Okay.
Hi. I think that was, yeah, it's Mani. I think that was a difficult time in her family's history, and for them to then change their religion because of I guess how they were being treated. So I'm not sure the interviewer asked the follow-up questions in a knowledgeable way. It seemed a little bit awkward. She was just saying, oh, that's interesting. And so do you think they would be allowed in the hospital? Do you think, like, how does she know if they would have been allowed in the hospital? So I wasn't sure that her follow-up questions were appropriate for the situation that was really traumatic for them.
Right. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Let's see. We got Nicole. Nicole, what do you think?
Hi, yeah, actually, just to build off of both of the two examples that have been shared, I thought that the interviewer did a really great job of kind of like keeping to that storyline, but also keeping track of what had been shared so that they could ask some kind of like follow-up questions. I think Mani's response was really interesting. I think that it can be difficult to figure out what is the right balance for having, like listening with sensitivity and having empathy. And also like acknowledging that maybe they're talking about a sensitive topic. And I thought the interviewer did an okay job of that, but I was interested to hear Mani's response, and that made me kind of like think again about what I was listening and saying, like, oh, I think they did a pretty good job of that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And we got Cecile.
This might seem like a really trivial thing, but I was very mindful of where the interview of the physician took place. We're sitting in her living room on a lovely sofa, but more importantly, her photographs of her family are behind her. And so immediately we understand that her story is about her family and her eventual professional development. You see the arc. And the only other comment, and everyone has already pointed this out, is that she clearly was affected by her family's experience at Tafran, etc. But do we know, is she Japanese? No one has asked that. And I agree with the earlier comment. Perhaps instead of saying interesting, very interesting, I might have reinforced, oh, your family was Japanese and they were put in a internment camp during the war.
Right. Okay. Thank you all for those wonderful comments. And I guess I'll just speak to Cecile, what you're hearing just a little clip of a probably 4-hour interview. So that earlier context about family background, etc., I believe that was covered and probably in the very opening as we are introducing this whole topic of family, family background and how did your family, I always ask people about their grandparents, did you know your grandparents? Tell me about your grandparents, because then you can go a little bit further back and really get a sense of the family history. So the point that was made about the interviewer guiding through, this is one of the reasons I really wanted to show you this clip, because what often happens in an interview is you need to take a detour. Something comes up in the interview and your interviewer senses go off and you say, oh, that seems really important. I don't want to ignore that. I need to kind of get off the highway here, and I need to see where this path is going to take me. And in the case of this interview, it was this issue that was coming up about the death of the child. This seemed a fruitful path to go. What was going on here? Why did this happen? Do we have an issue of systemic racism where there was not healthcare that was being allowed? Not the interviewer wasn't quite sure, but felt that it was important to take this detour. Something unexpected came up in the interview. So she took the detour, she got off the road, but then, as Lori pointed out, we went there for a while, we tried to find out what was going on, and then we got back on the path of, okay, where are we in the story? What happened next? So it's a very, very important skill as an oral historian. You need to listen, because otherwise you're gonna miss those really fruitful opportunities for a detour. And you gotta kind of have that outline sort of in front of you, so you know where to get back on the path. Yeah, and it is tricky in family history to know where to probe. And one of the things as an interviewer I always try to tell people is, if the interview takes us into an area that you're uncomfortable with, just say pass, or, oh, I prefer not to answer that. You can suss out a lot of those sensitivities during that preliminary meeting. I remember in an interview preliminary meeting once, I had mentioned that I'd like to talk to my interviewee about her family background. And she said, I would like to do that a little bit, but she told me about a death of a sibling that had happened in her early life that she didn't feel comfortable talking about yet, that she really didn't want the interview to go there, that it was really emotional for her. So we figured out a way together how to cover that early background, with me steering clear of a question that would have confronted her in an interview situation with having to talk specifically to this sibling issue. So it is important to be sensitive. And sometimes you're not sure as an interviewer exactly what the historical situation wouldn't be. But I always say, it's okay to ask if you ask in a sensitive way and you've developed that rapport. People can always say, I don't feel comfortable answering, or if you really sense that maybe you shouldn't go any further, you can back off. Okay, do we have any thoughts on any of those, either of the other clips, the Board of Trustees member, or the Gavin Wright clip? Any other, why do you think I played those clips? Al. Okay, go for it, Al.
Well, I don't know if this is what you played it, but I love the Board of Trustees interview, or first as a woman, just hearing that. But I thought the interviewer was very sensitive of the interviewee and what she was able to and comfortable sharing and what she was not. Now, the interviewee also made that pretty clear, but right. the interviewer respected that.
Right. Okay. All right. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move along, and thank you, Al, because I think that the interviewer did a great job in that Board of Trustees clip. I want to just resume my screen share here. And we're going to go back to our toolkit again here. But I want to emphasize this slide first before we go back into the toolkit. You saw in each of those examples, our interviewers were really listening. They were listening in a way that allowed them to probe for more information, to take that detour and get back on. And there were some really some good listening skills that I think were happening there. And, I never used to show this slide or teach about listening. But I noticed a lot of examples where people were not listening. And this is a hard job as an oral historian. If you see this fellow in the blue shirt, he's listening, right? You sense that he's hearing, he's leaning in, there's eye contact. He's listening with his body, right? So I was taught about active listening when I was a student. I don't know if they still teach that, but I think it made a huge impression on me because I really bring this to my job every day. And, you know, you can look online and find lots of graphics about how to be an active listener. And this is one that I found online and modified a little bit to add this idea that you're listening with your heart and really think about trying to understand the perspective and to make a connection with your interviewee through your listening. And some pretty magical things can happen when you allow yourself to really listen with your heart. Okay, so to the toolkit. What you heard in that Board of Trustees clip was a wonderful example of a prompt. It's a very important tool for an oral historian. So you need to use a prompt when you want to elicit some more detail about something. For example, really, tell me more. I use this one a lot. Just tell me more. That's interesting. I want to hear more about that. Can you give me an example? I was so happy when I got that interview back and heard my interviewer doing this. Our interviewee said something kind of provocative about femininity and in the boardroom. And our interviewer, she kind of called her on it a little bit and said, well, what does that look like? Can you give me an example of that? And, you know, oftentimes our interviewees will talk in very abstract kind of terms, or they won't say what they really mean. And this is your chance to get out that prompt and to use it. I always say to anybody that's working with me, I said, when I get that interview back, I really want to hear you at least 2 times using a prompt to try to get some more details and to ask a little bit further. Why do you think that happened? You can ask a why question as a prompt. Talked about active listening in your toolkit. The tool of silence is something to remember. So often we think we have to fill every moment in an interview with talk, and just be aware that sometimes allowing something to just sit while somebody thinks about how they want to respond or allows the memories to come back and form into words is a really important thing you can do as an oral historian. Okay, we also have the tool of a follow-up question, building on what your interviewee has said in order to get some more information or to go in a little bit of a different direction. Backtracking to delve deeper, you saw an example of that. Sometimes you can use a follow-up connection to try to connect topics, things that you're hearing in the interview. And try to avoid leading questions if you can. So questions where you're saying, for example, oh, that was really difficult, wasn't it? Or that would have been really terrible. Maybe you, instead of making that judgment, could say something like, what was that like for you? Instead of kind of leading with your opinion that it must have been really terrible. Okay, 2-step question format is one I want to just show you an example of quickly. This can be used when you want to ask a question that might seem a little bit hard or awkward or controversial. It's a statement followed by a question. And it's, here's an example of it. I think this is probably the best thing to do. I read that some members of the group were critical of the way you handled the negotiations. How did you feel about their critique? A historically significant question here. There were some important negotiations, and perhaps my interviewee has been criticized for the way they dealt with it. So instead of ignoring that controversy, right, I've figured out a way to ask a question about it. But I'm kind of removing myself as the interviewer from the heat of that question. So we're distancing ourselves a little bit from it, but still putting the question on the table. I hope that makes sense. It's an important tool that you can use if you have a question that you're a little bit worried about how to ask. Okay, and then just conceptually, I really like what Lori said before about guiding during an interview. And if you think about your job conceptually as an oral historian, you really are kind of providing a reflective space. You're not cross-examining or interrogating. You're sort of like a tour bus driver. I love this little picture here. The tour bus driver's job is to drive to all of these different topics and events and times of life, and to give the interviewee a chance to speak to them, right? So you're kind of doing the driving in a gentle way and making sure that we get to all the stops that our interviewee wants to get to. Okay, I'm not going to go through these examples about place and photos, but I just want to say really quickly about the example with Gavin Wright. It's something that's really important especially when you're trying to document technologies or crafts or something that people in the past might not, in the future might not understand about the past, right? So in the example of Gavin Wright, here's an economist who was using computers in his work when that was very early stage for that to happen. So I wanted to elicit in that interview, well, what did that look like? What did that mean? People now, in order to do the kind of calculations he was doing, they could probably just make a spreadsheet and put some formulas in there. But it was much more complicated in the 1960s when he was doing that work. So I call it an example of everyday practice interviewing, where you're asking your interviewee to become a storyteller about a particular practice. And I could give you lots of additional examples, but he was giving us, this is what the everyday practice looked like back then. And especially when you're interviewing people about their job or about their work or their childcare or whatever, this is a really good time to ask them to narrate. Tell me what a typical day looked like for you. What did that involve using that computer tape? We often call it, one of my colleagues at Berkeley talks about it as the rotary telephone in the room. I don't know how many of our younger guests have ever used a rotary telephone, but you used to have to find the number, you stuck your finger in the hole and you would go like this, right? People in 100 years from now might not understand what that experience was. So think about in your interview, what is the rotary telephone in the room? Okay, I want to give a couple of tips because we just have a few minutes left. And this is to think about, this is related to recording. So you really want to think about your recording environment. Don't interview in a restaurant or while you're enjoying some refreshments. It's not pleasant to hear the chewing, etc. on the tape. Want to try to minimize noise and distractions. And if there's an interruption that happens, let's say the doorbell rings or the vacuum cleaner is going off at the next room, don't be too stressed about it. It is good if there's a lot of background noise for just to pause for a minute and let the background noise, work itself out and then restart again. Because when you get the tape back, you might be able to actually hear what the interviewee is saying. But if you wanted to use that in like on a website or in a podcast, it's very hard to get rid of, say, the vacuum cleaner in the background. Very, very, very difficult to edit that out. Whereas you could easily edit out that pause where you just paused until the vacuum cleaner stopped. I usually recommend not going more than 2 hours in a session. People get tired, just like we're reaching the end of our 2 hours now, and people are getting tired, right? But you can always do more than one session. This is me after I got a tape back where my interviewee had forgotten to turn on the recorder or there was some other problem. This does happen. It's an oral historian's worst nightmare that you get a recorder back and the interview's not there or something happens to interfere with it. And this is a responsibility that you have to really know your equipment and to practice. Have lots of extra batteries if you're doing this in person. Make sure you have enough space on your device. And we implemented a practice here at the oral history program that we always make a backup recording. Could just be on our iPhone, or we send an extra recorder, but just in case. The stewardship of the interview is very important. So once you do an interview, get it off of the recorder as soon as possible, put it in a safe place. And in the libraries, we have a saying called locks. It's lots of copies keep stuff safe. So, you know, I have interviews on a server, I have them in a cloud, and then eventually we have them transcribed as well. I won't talk a lot about audio settings, etc. But it will be in the slides, and I'll be available for any questions. Additionally, about recorders, this is the recorder that we use when we do in-person interviews. It's inexpensive, it's easy to use. It records in WAV format, which is good for archival preservation because it's uncompressed. Not totally necessary, but if you do have access to a device that records in WAV, archivists really prefer that. There's additional recommendations at the websites I'll give you here. And Ida Rose had asked a question in the chat, and Lori as well, about Zoom interviewing. And during the pandemic, our program switched over to Zoom interviewing. And I've given you some resources here about how to interview remotely. And Zoom interviewing is both wonderful and awesome because it allows you to interview people that you never would have been able to get to otherwise. But it's also challenging. There's a little bit of the human connection that seems like it's lost. But I've been pretty impressed with the way people have adapted to it. And we love the video component that is there now that used to be much more difficult for us to obtain that kind of video. With Zoom, you can just record the interview with your video on, and then you've got that and you can archive it if the quality is good enough. So we're in a transition phase right now. We've gone back to some in-person interviewing, but a lot of people prefer Zoom for whatever reason, locations, scheduling, etc. All right, we're at time. I can talk a little bit about transcription, editing, etc. But rather than do that, I want to show you a quick summary, and then we'll go to questions, and I can stay a little bit longer. Okay, I want to show you this summary slide because we really learned a lot in these last 2 hours. We talked about the importance of good beginnings and having that intro. You got lots of different question tools, especially that open-ended question and the use of a prompt. We talked briefly about family history, the importance of listening, that sensitivity to your interviewee and the audience and the usage of the materials in the future. We gave you some ideas for interview prep. We talked about this very important notion of shared authority, and we gave some practical tips. So we really covered a lot. This was a whirlwind, but I hope it was helpful. And I'm happy to stay a few minutes longer if anybody has specific questions. Any other practical tips you'd like, I'm happy to do that. But for those of you that need to go, I will not be offended, but I will hang around for a little bit longer to answer questions. I loved that you all attended. Thank you so much.